Gordon will now lead us in our readings. Thanks, Gordon.
Right. The first reading today is from Exodus 16, verses 2 to 15, manna and quail. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I shall test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening, you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning, you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling and against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was a glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew round the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." The second reading today is from Psalm 105. God's mighty deeds in bringing Israel to the promised land, remembering his miracles, encourages us to keep living close to him. Verses 1 to 6. "Give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing praise to him, tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord and his strength, seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob." Verses 37 to 45. "He has brought out Israel laden with gold and with silver and gold. Unto among the tribes no one faltered. Egypt was glad when they left, because dread of Israel had fallen on them. He spread out a cloud as a covering and a fire to give light at night. They asked, and he brought them quail. He fed them well with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock and water gushed out. It flowed like a river in the desert. For he remembered his holy promise given to his servant Abraham. He brought out his people with rejoicing, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. He gave them the lands of the nations, and they fell heir to what others had toiled for, that they might keep his precepts and observe his laws. Praise to the Lord." Here ends the reading. Thanks to God.
Thanks, Gordon, for that reading. As you can see on the screen, that's my message for today. There's a bit more to it than that, but That's a start. We all acknowledge, don't we, that God provides for us. Every day we thank God for our daily bread and things like that. But it's when we face scarcity, that's when it becomes a little bit harder, doesn't it? When we face the prospect that perhaps there's no bread today, are we prepared to trust God in those times? I wanted to talk firstly about George Mueller. Some of you have probably heard about George Mueller. An amazing story, absolutely amazing. It's just, if you get a chance, apparently there's a book on him which I haven't read, but it's about 400 odd pages long, and it tells his story in a lot of detail, which I won't today. You can rest assured about that. But he was born in 1805 in Prussia, which is now part of Germany. His first 20 years were wasted years, really. He was born from a non-Christian family, and he just went to rack and ruin, really. He was gambling, he was stealing. He ended up being put in prison. And at that stage, his father intervened and said, this isn't going according to plan. And he got him out of prison and he enrolled him in seminary. He thought, this will straighten him out. This will make a good man out of him. But what happened is he dropped out. He said, oh, this isn't for me. Because at that time, to become a minister was like a guaranteed income. So regardless of what everyone else was doing, and times are pretty tough for a lot of people, if you went into the ministry, and John probably might speak to differ about this, it was actually a guaranteed income, and you had all the trappings of whatever you needed. And so that's why his father enrolled him in ministry, not because he had any conviction about Christianity or anything like that. And so he ended up dropping out. He said, no, this isn't for me. And it wasn't till sometime later that he came across some evangelicals. And they were a little bit different to the normal run-of-the-mill establishment religion type things. And they impressed on him the fact that he needed to trust God. Now, this was something which was quite foreign to him. Trusting God? What's all that about? But he actually took that on board. And from then on, he vowed that he would trust God in everything he did. And he went on to establish a series of orphanages throughout, well, by that stage he was in England, in Bristol, which was the slave port of England at the time, where all the slaves were brought in, and often they were orphans. Their parents had died on the voyage, or they'd been taken away from their parents, or whatever it was. There was a lot of orphans in Bristol, in other towns around England as well. But Bristol was where it started. And he continued with his idea of just trusting God. He had no money, no means, and he relied on donations through prayer. He just prayed that God would provide whatever was needed as it was needed. And so it happened that God did provide. He prayed and things happened. And there's one classic story about George Mueller, was that he was in an orphanage where there was, I think at some stage there was 300 orphans in the orphanage. And they sat down for a meal with breakfast, put all the plates out, all the cutlery. Kids all filed in, sat down, gave thanks for the meal. but there's nothing on the plates. And the kids must have been wondering, well, it's all very well to give thanks, but where's the food? So there wasn't any. But as soon as he'd given thanks, there was a knock on the door. He opened the door and there was a baker there. He said he'd had a dream that night that he had to provide bread for this orphanage. And he brought all this bread in, so the children had bread to eat. And then shortly after that, there's another knock on the door. And here was the milkman. His cart had broken down in front of the orphanage, and he had no way of getting the milk back to where it was supposed to go. So he said, can you use this milk? It's going to go to waste. And Georgia says, yes, thank you so much, you know. And he brought it in, and that was the meal for the orphans for that time. And this happened time and time again. It wasn't a one-off situation. Absolutely amazing. Well, I also wanted just to talk about a few scriptural examples. There's the example in Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve were commanded to eat of all the fruit of the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So God provided all this food for them. And we know, of course, what happened. They ate all those things, but Eve, through the serpent, was beguiled to think, well, perhaps we should be eating this too, become like the gods. And so they ate that, and we know what happened. They were ashamed. They tried to cover their nakedness with fig leaves, which wasn't adequate. God saw their nakedness, and God provided the coverings for their nakedness. And also in Genesis chapter 3, we read that they were cast out of the garden, but the cherubim guarded or kept the way. God provided the way back to him. In all those instances, God provided. Some more examples. Abram and Sarai. They were promised a son. Remember how that all went. Years went by, nothing happened. And then Sarai said to Abram, perhaps you should be having a son through my handmaid, Hagar. And we know how that all happened. There was Ishmael and all sorts of rivalry there. But after a lot of time, God provided. God provided a son called Isaac. And then in Genesis chapter 22, an extraordinary story where God tells Abram to go and sacrifice your son on the mountain. Extraordinary, after God had promised him this son. And we read the story that they went up to the mountain together. And Isaac asks Abram, you know, you've got the wood, you've got the knife, but where's the animal? And Abram just says, God will provide. Another example of God providing. And sure enough, he puts Isaac on the altar, he ties him up, he draws the knife, and then he hears a voice saying, stop. I know that you trust me. And there's a ram. God provided a ram for the sacrifice. God provides again in the most extraordinary circumstances in life. Well, now we turn to Exodus. It's replete with ways that God provided. In the Passover, we read how God provided salvation. God provided a difference between the Israelites who trusted God and who were prepared to obey him by sacrificing the Passover lamb, by painting its blood on the lintels of the door. And God sent his angel and passed over the Israelites who believed and trusted God in his provision. And so in chapter 13 of Exodus, God provided salvation. In chapter 15 of Exodus, the people were thirsty, but there was only bitter water there to drink. But God provided a way to make it sweet. And then our reading today, chapter 16. The people were hungry and they questioned Moses. They said, "Have you brought us out into the wilderness to die?" And then in chapter 16, we read how God provided food, both quail and manna. The quail is interesting because it is a flightless bird. It's a bird from the earth. God provided a flightless bird, something from the earth. But also he provided manna, which is mentioned more times than quail in this record. And I think it's mentioned more times for emphasis that manna is more important than quail, because manna was the bread from heaven. Manna was something that they could live on. Which brings us, of course, to Jesus. Jesus in John chapter 6 said he is the bread of life. He is the bread from heaven. If any man eat from him, he will not hunger. He will have eternal life. Amen.